Hello beautiful people. Today I'll be mainly talking about the World Economic Forum, UN, their links to the Fabian Society, and some of the other powers behind what we're seeing in the world today. It's become increasingly clear to me that it's not just one group or organisation behind what we're seeing, but rather an ideology which spans across many groups. I will refer to this ideology as the divine right of kings, which goes back centuries at least. It's the idea that certain families and bloodlines have been appointed by God to oversee and control humanity however they see fit. Essentially, they take up the role of God, and we can be herded like animals into any situation they design, and they're very cunning in the way they do it. They create a problem, fear of a virus, they manipulate the reaction, social distancing, isolation, shame muzzles, statistical manipulation, genocide of the elderly population, which I'll get into in a later video, and applied psychology pushing fear and compliance. And then they provide the solution: vaccine, digital IDs, cashless society, and furthering their goals to global governance. There's a lot to cover, so let's dive in. First, I'd like to talk about this video from the World Economic Forum, which is a roundtable discussion between Achim Steiner, the head of the UN Development Programme, Bank of America, Unilever, Microsoft and Bloomberg. So first of all, let's take a look at these organisations. Bank of America was behind one of the biggest fraud scandals in modern banking history, where Merrill Lynch doctored paperwork on 16 million orders between 2008 and 2013 to fool institutional clients into thinking stock trades were taking place in-house when they were not. New York's Attorney General Eric Schneiderman said that Bank of America Merrill Lynch went to astonishing lengths to defraud its own institutional clients about who was seeing and filling their orders. A scathing article from the Rolling Stone describes the bank as a hyper-gluttonous ward of the state whose limitless fraud and criminal conspiracies we'll all be paying for until the end of time. Now, Unilever is one of the small handful of transnational food and agriculture corporations which have gained unprecedented control over our food all the way from seed to supermarket shelf. In 2005, ActionAid found that they had been pushing down prices paid to farmers, forcing small-scale farmers out of business, disregarding the rights of some communities, and even using child labour on their cottonseed farms in India. Many of these workers, mostly young girls, were under 10 years old and often exposed to dangerous pesticides. You would have thought that they would have cleaned up their act after that, but they were found again in 2016 by Amnesty International using child labour in their palm oil fields in Indonesia. Amnesty alleged products sold by these companies were, quote, tainted by appalling human rights abuses, with children as young as 8 working in hazardous conditions, unquote. On top of this, in the early 2000s, they faced controversy at one of their thermometer factories in south of India. Workers say they were instructed by the company to bury tons of mercury-bearing toxic wastes in several locations inside and around the factory. Mercury is a toxin that can cause brain damage and birth defects, and is also found in vaccines. Excuse me, I must have the Rona. The company has actively thwarted independent verification or scientific studies tainted by its influence or money. They were also accused of failing to compensate workers and their family members who were victims of mercury exposure. Great company, right? Microsoft is another company with a great virtuous exterior, but when you look inside, there's various sexism and harassment scandals, a Romanian bribe scandal, an improper payment scheme in Hungary, a sex trafficking scandal, and let's not forget everything about Bill Gates. That's a whole bag of cats. I'm just going to touch on his links to Jeffrey Epstein. And now Bloomberg, one of the great globalist fake news media companies. In 2015 and 16, one of their fake news stories was found to have manipulated the stock market, causing a French construction company, Vinci, to fall 18%, erasing €6 billion from the company's value. Bloomberg was fined $7.6 million for reporting fake news, but instead of apologising and taking responsibility, instead Bloomberg spun it so that they were the victim. How virtuous. Let's also not forget that Michael Bloomberg, owner of Bloomberg Media, appeared in Jeffrey Epstein's Little Black Book. Now let's talk about the last person on this panel, Achim Steiner, the head of the UN Development Programme. I find it interesting how the son of a German farmer who had emigrated to Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil managed to work his way up to Oxford University, the University of London and Harvard Business School, being born of a farmer. Then I looked into the Steiner surname. This goes back to European nobility, as seen in this book here on the genealogy of the Steiner family. Then I found this book, The Fifth Column in Brazil, The Nazi Conspiracy in Rio Grande do Sul, which is written by a senior officer of the Brazilian army and the chief of police in the southernmost state of Brazil. It documents how the Nazis after World War II created strong cells in the area. Now, there was a high-ranking SS officer with the same surname, but I can't find a relation to Achim Steiner. Even if there was a link, there's nothing to say that he shares the same ideology, although his position at the head of the UN Development Programme, placing himself in a position of global power, would suggest that he has some kind of power complex over people, be it divine right of kings or otherwise. So let's take a look at this video. I'll try and sum it up in the quickest way possible.
History teaches us that sometimes out of crisis come great moments of pivoting forward.
The European Commission and soon the European Parliament's passage of a Green Deal, new language in the European Commission, new language by the SEC, new language by the International Federation of Accountants, broadening its mandate beyond pure financials.
And so we're huge supporters of standardizing, actually, and mandating non-financial reporting that Anne referred to.
Abide by the Green Deal.
Create belief.
Well, the first thing I would point to is climate, and I think in particular carbon. That's why we committed that we'll be carbon negative as a company.
Before this pandemic, and we witnessed on our television, sets every night, protests breaking out from Hong Kong to Santiago de Chile to Paris, the United States. I mean, there is a great deal of conflict that is manifesting itself around the kind of choices that have been made. So I think the first thing is we must acknowledge that indeed we are in the midst of a situation that is perhaps without precedent, and in an odd sort of way, the long term has suddenly become the short term reality. And the short-term decisions that we make have become the lock-ins for the long term. And, revolutionary transformations are possible, but they need to be embraced by leaders in business. Governments have to incentivize, enable them. And I think then consumers will reward people also and companies for making those choices.
Climate.
Carbon neutral. And to be carbon neutral, that means you have to have the greenhouse gas protocol evaluate your work in 3 scopes, 1, 2, and 3. 1 and 2 are what make you carbon neutral. 3 is what will get us all to net zero. The European Parliament, who will soon pass a Green Deal. Once the Green Deal is passed, it isn't just that we'll be at net zero in 2050, it's that we will be more than halfway there by 2030. 2030 is like yesterday for us. Abide by the Green Deal. There will be a market. There'll be carbon pricing, I think. There will be a market for the offsets. And that's actually an economic opportunity for those that are in the renewable business.
Well, the first thing I would point to is climate, and I think in particular carbon. And I think this is where businesses together with NGOs can move more quickly and lay the foundation. And ultimately, absolutely, we need governments to do more, both individually and collectively, regionally and globally. That's the only hope for more progress on something like the Sustainable Development Goals.
On the one hand, look to the larger corporations who shape markets and also consumer perception to be leaders in moving these agendas forward. And the imperatives to act on something like climate change are much more central.
I think that big companies have got the responsibility to pioneer the techniques and methodologies that we were talking about and make them available to smaller companies.
So you get the idea. If they were discussing how they could run their own businesses better, fine, whatever, no one cares. But these unelected bureaucrats are dictating how all businesses should be operating on the false premise of a man-made climate emergency, which has been scientifically disproven. Yes, you heard me correctly. Here's a quick video to sum things up for you.
As the climate lexicon begins to flutter with discourse of an even more extreme reactionary nature, there comes time for an unbiased observer to say enough. The Green Deal, California's no gas cars by 2035 plan, the restrictions they want to place on the world and will advocate for soon, are completely asinine. After numerous predictions which the news media ignored, the forecast has borne out. The economic, commercial, industrial, travel, and other aspects of the slowdown worldwide due to COVID-19 has heated the planet. This is one of the top journals in the world. The things that many people wish to shut down are contributing to aerosol cooling of the atmosphere, albedo, cloud reflectivity, and the more we shut down, the warmer the planet will get. This seems utterly contrary to everything most people have ever been told about climate change, but it's the facts. It's the first time anything like this has actually been tried. Outside of mathematics on paper, that is. And this is something that could have been foreseen and, as I mentioned, was in numerous cases. Not by anyone who gets grant money to discover how terrible carbon dioxide is, mind you, but they did exist. And the science on this is not new. We've known for months now, since the CO2 bias, oversensitivity, and uncertainty numbers came out, that eventually this focus on pollution-driven warming was going to snitch on them. Now it has. It's been a ridiculously atrocious year for climate science. We've recently seen it in the oceans, with confirmations of the planet's defense mechanism, and it's really just about asking whether it's the northern melting or it will be the southern melting that will cool the planet first, not if it will occur. The ocean currents of most importance and the large circulations are already changing, and we're still waiting for Yale's cold climate bomb to be unleashed by the Beaufort Gyre's cold freshwater. Polar melt story fell apart as well. I know I didn't convince many of my regular viewers to watch Michael Moore's documentary, Planet of the Humans, like I'm bad at this or something, but he did flip on the global warming folks and destroyed their alternative energy paradigm, and credit where it's due, he's right. But please, do wait a bit before telling Elon he's having a rough alternative energy week as it is. Dozens of papers crescendoed this year into our plea to the AGU to refocus on answering the greatest uncertainty in climate models with the fastest growing arm of it. It's not just oversensitivity to CO2, causing bias in the models, hiding uncertainties about clouds and climate responses, but the large-scale coupling that includes the stratosphere. Most of that forcing comes from the sun, the answer to the uncertainty they told everyone was climate certainty just years ago. When the AGU begins dedicating considerable time at its fall meeting to a topic, it's real, and so are the 500 citations in my textbook on the subject. How the sun touches every aspect of this world, often in ways that you never imagined, but can easily understand with simple electromagnetic science. The truth is, the greatest solar activity of the last 12,000 years just ended about 15 to 20 years ago, and it's about a 20 to 30 year lag out of the ocean. Volcanic cooling hasn't been this low in centuries, giving that higher solar activity a freer path to the surface. The magnetic field of Earth has been changing and has played an enormous role in this as well. The certainty they've told us about in climate isn't so certain, but the answers are there waiting in the sun. The alternative energy paradigm to the modern world isn't so great either, and the changes we already see in the oceans are going to trigger an ice age on this planet. But if we shut down, it warms the planet even faster, and that's because it was never about CO2 or industry. We can have both. We can still fight pollution, but for the right reasons. It's paramount we understand the 180 this planet's atmosphere is about to pull on us and the real causes of the changes we've seen. I'll see you tomorrow for the daily update. Be safe, everyone.
So in a nutshell, the main driver of climate is the sun's activity and solar cycles. Our future is cold, and all we've been doing is slowing down the inevitable. Another good point to drive things home is that weather modification and manipulation is a very well documented fact, but that's for another video. All of my links will be in the description below, including a link to the Suspicious Observers channel, which I highly recommend people look at. So all of the people on this panel are either misled or they're in on the deception, and their intentions may be good, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So why would they continue to lie to us and beat this dead horse? Well, it's to push their agenda for a one-world government, with help from some very well-paid, quote-unquote, scientists and globalist media organisations like Bloomberg. In the words of Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Now I know what you're thinking. That's just conspiracy theory. Well, the UN states it pretty clearly in most of their documents. This has been planned out for a long, long time. So what's the problem with global governance? It sounds great. Well, let's have a look at their agendas. In particular, Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. Here's some clips from a very good documentary film entitled Unsustainable, featuring some very good researchers and commentators, such as G. Edward Griffin and Lord Christopher Monckton.
Agenda 21 is a 351-page document, and obviously if anyone can go on the internet and see it, common sense would tell us that it could not be a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact.
In reading Clause 1.1 of the preamble, it's obvious Agenda 21 was written by lawyers. Given this, we now know that 99% of the global population, plus the illiterate, will probably not read it. Then, Clause 1.2 makes it clear that Agenda 21 is a global partnership, an innocent partnership built on a resolution from the UN's friendly General Assembly.
All members of the United Nations belong to the General Assembly. Only a few belong to the Security Council compared to the 193 as General Assembly. The United States has a veto, but rarely exercises the veto. They go ahead and they accept whatever the UN wants to be done, and our ambassador to the United Nations, usually a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, will go along with almost anything.
Clause 1.3 goes on to say that the agenda reflects a global consensus and its implementation is first and foremost the responsibility of governments. By reading the first three clauses, any intelligent citizen can see that Agenda 21 is not only a plan and a partnership, but a call for governments of the world to unite. Sound familiar? Earlier, didn't Karl Marx, founder of communism, call for workers of the world to unite? The idea of uniting to overthrow capitalism and its middle class.
Karl Marx is known for his theory of Marxism and economics, where largely government controls the means of production and the power of the economy is not invested in the creativity of the individual, but invested more in government, and it's a top-down control of our economy as opposed to being driven by the people themselves.
So, communism died. Or did it? Sounds like the United Nations has resurrected communism and repackaged it as Agenda 21. After all, what could be better than a planet-wide central system of government control to ensure better protected and managed ecosystems, as stated in Clause 1.1?
Central planning is a concept in totalitarian regimes by which all decision-making and all power and all wealth are held not by individual families, not by corporations, but only by the state. The state therefore takes all decisions, decides how every town and village should be planned, how it should look, how everything that moves and has its being in the country shall be directed from the center.
Let's start with the UN's Declaration of Human Rights and see how it compares with the U.S. Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights is a set of absolutes. Here they are. You can't do this, and this, and there's no exception clause. Whereas the Declaration of Human Rights in the UN system specifically says, well, these rights can be exercised as long as they don't conflict with the purposes and goals of the United Nations. Well, who determines that? Well, the political people that are operating in the United Nations.
We see that the following words are prominent in the U.S. Bill of Rights: petition, probable cause, trial by jury, due process, unreasonable searches, excessive bail, free state. But when we search for these words in the UN's declaration, none of them are present.
If you were to take the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, you will see two vastly different documents. One of them protects rights that are ours, God-given. The other one gives rights and then qualifies those rights out of existence.
I don't know about you, but this is a little creepy. A Bill of Rights for a 193 government partnership that has no mention of the right to petition, no mention of probable cause, no mention of trial by jury, no mention of due process, and no mention of freedom from unreasonable searches. The UN Declaration sounds like a recipe for a police state. But even scarier, it sounds like a recipe for a really big police state.
Jails, prisons, fines, death penalties if necessary. A police state is where its primary characteristic is that the police are at your doorstep. The police are telling you what to do, or at least they're to make sure you do it after the politicians tell you what to do. So a police state is a totalitarian state. What we need to do is get rid of the police component of the state. Let's make the state something to protect us, not to police us.
The worst thing is, nowhere in the UN's declaration is the right to keep and bear arms, or the right to own real estate, what the founders called private property. These omissions guarantee what we're looking at could really be nasty, especially if the wrong people got in there to rule.
So, terrible soundtrack aside, this is a really good, informative documentary. And I'd recommend anyone who's sceptical or wants more information on this to go and look at it. Link is in the description. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. The UN's not that bad, is it? They're peacekeepers after all, aren't they? They just want what's best for humanity, don't they? They're not criminals, are they? Well, let's take a look. Since the inception of the UN, there have been over 240 armed conflicts around the world. The UN authorised the use of force just twice, with the Korean War and the First Gulf War. That means if you live in a country where war breaks out, you have a 0.0083% chance that the UN will actually send troops to help you out, which makes it still more likely than dying from COVID-19. Now, the list of corruption and scandals from the UN is quite long. I won't bore you with all of the details, but it involves accepting bribes, money laundering, silence on human rights violations, general corruption, sexual harassment, the rape of 60,000 people by UN aid workers, employing an estimated 3,300 paedophiles, a sex scandal involving the Secretary General Antonio Guteres, cover-ups, and let's not forget their involvement in a child sex ring in Haiti. Anyone who's researched what's happened in Haiti knows of the disgusting crimes that have been committed there by high-up government officials. Now, digging into Antonio Guterres, we see that aside from calling for universal basic income, i.e. dependence on a centralised state, he was silent on the atrocities against the Uyghur Muslims in China, so as not to upset the Chinese government. After the UN's role in the Haitian cholera outbreak, only $10 million has been contributed to the proposed $400 million to help fight cholera in the area and provide material assistance to victims. He's constantly pushing the climate change agenda, and there's various accounts of him covering up sexual abuse, spanning a number of countries. Lastly, here's a clip of ex-UN representative Claire Edwards addressing Antonio Guterres directly on the dangers of 5G.
Mr. Secretary General, UN staff have repeatedly been told that they are the most important resource of this organisation. Since December 2015, the staff here at the Vienna International Centre have been exposed to off-the-scale electromagnetic radiation from Wi-Fi and mobile phone boosters installed on very low ceilings throughout the buildings. Current public exposure levels are at least 1 quintillion, that's 18 zeros, 1 quintillion times above natural background radiation, according to Professor Olle Johansson of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. The highly dangerous biological effects of EMFs have been documented by thousands of studies since 1932, indicating that we may be facing a global health catastrophe orders of magnitude worse than those caused by tobacco and cigarettes. Mr. Secretary General, on the basis of the precautionary principle, I urge you to have these EMF-emitting devices removed immediately from these buildings and to call a halt to any rollout of 5G at UN duty stations, because 5G is designed to deliver concentrated and focused electromagnetic radiation in excess of 100 times current levels in the same way as do directed energy weapons. In line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, to protect, respect and remedy, 5G technologies must be subjected to an independent health and safety assessment before they are launched anywhere in the world. There is currently an international appeal signed by 237 EMF scientists from 41 nations urging the UN and particularly the WHO to exert strong leadership in fostering the development of more protective EMF guidelines, encouraging precautionary measures and educating the public about the considerable health risks, particularly the risks to children and fetal development. Mr. Secretary General, I think we have a unique opportunity here at the UN office at Vienna. Since our medical records are digitized, you have the choice and the possibility of releasing data on a closed population exposed to off-the-scale levels of electromagnetic radiation in a metal-walled building, which exacerbates the situation, to establish if there have already been abnormal health consequences for the UN staff here in the last 28 months. I urge you to do so and stop any rollout of 5G immediately. Thank you.
Sorry, because we are talking with someone that is a little bit ignorant on these things. We're talking to the Wi-Fi systems?
On the ceilings of these buildings, Wi-Fi boosters and cell phone boosters were installed without consultation, without information to staff in December 2015. The situation here is extremely dangerous. I have heard anecdotally of many people who have had health problems. I don't know if they are related, but the precautionary principle would dictate that we use our medical records to look into this and that we remove these dangerous devices immediately. Thank you.
Well, I become worried because I put those devices in my house.
Not a good idea.
I will have to, I confess my ignorance on this. We will have to, but I'm going to raise this with WHO, which I think is the organization that might be able to deal with it properly, for them to, put someone, their staff or organizations to work on that, because I must confess I was not aware of that danger. To the extent that I put those things in the rooms of my house, in the ceiling.
I would suggest that everybody start looking into this issue, and particularly into 5G, which 237 scientists from 41 countries consider a threat that is far worse than the tobacco and the cigarette, the asbestos threats of the past.
Well, maybe I have learned something completely new, and I hope it will be very useful to me, but I confess it's the first time I hear about it.
It's also worth noting that Mr. Guteres studied physics and electrical engineering and had a career as an assistant professor teaching systems theory and telecommunication signals. So he should know all about this, right? But this didn't put a halt to the worldwide rollout of this technology, or the switching on starting at the end of 2019 in central China, specifically Wuhan, and then Iran, northern Italy, the rest of Europe, the USA, and other places around the world. Now, there was a sickness that hit the world around about this time. Can't remember the name of it, but it's completely unrelated. Don't worry about it. Go back to sleep. Now, bringing things back full circle, remember what I said at the beginning about the divine right of kings ideology and the problem reaction solution? Well, here's the solution, brought to you by Prince Charles of the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have been invited to open this year's critical Climate Week. The borderless climate, biodiversity and health crises are all symptoms of a planet that has been pushed beyond its planetary boundaries. Without swift and immediate action at an unprecedented pace and scale, we will miss the window of opportunity to reset for a green-blue recovery and a more sustainable and inclusive future. In other words, the global pandemic is a wake-up call we simply cannot ignore. Having been at this now for well over 40 years, I have long observed that people tend not to act until there is a real crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, that crisis has been with us for far too many years, decried, denigrated, and denied. It is now rapidly becoming a comprehensive catastrophe that will dwarf the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. At this late stage, I can see no other way forward but to call for a Marshall-like plan for nature, people, and planet. With the planetary emergency so critical, with the permafrost melting in Siberia, for instance, producing dire effects on global warming, and with the Pantanal in Brazil being consumed by unprecedented numbers of fires, we could no longer go on like this, as if there was no tomorrow and no ultimate reckoning for our abuse of nature. So, what do we do? Without doubt, we must now put ourselves on a warlike footing, approaching our action from the perspective of a military-style campaign. That way, working together, we can combat this most grave and urgent challenge. If we have the resolve to shift our trajectory, we must start now by bringing forward our net zero target. I'm afraid 2050 simply suggests we have room to delay. Using the frameworks of my Sustainable Markets Initiative and the imperative of the Great Reset, and knowing that we are all familiar with the problem we face, I would just like to outline, if I may, 5 overall action areas of this Marshall-like plan for which coherent strategies should be assembled.
Well, there you have it. Jimmy Savile's mate asking for your trust in his Marshall-type plan to save the world. Obviously, he's totally trustworthy, and there's no reason for a full criminal investigation into the royal family. So who else is on board with this Marshall-type plan? Well, let's ask Boris.
At home, we're putting biodiversity targets into law, removing deforestation from our own supply chains, shifting our land use subsidies to support rather than damage nature. Internationally, we spearheaded the ambitious Global Ocean Alliance, committed to protecting at least 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. We've doubled our funding for international climate finance. We're launching a £500 million Blue Planet Fund to protect and restore marine ecosystems, and our Blue Belt programme is on track to protect marine areas the size of India. And of course, as co-host of COP26 and president of next year's G7, we're going to make sure the natural world stays right at the top of the global agenda. Because the rhinos and the pangolins and all the other threatened species and everyone who relies on that diversity of life, they need more than good intentions. They need concerted, coordinated global action.
Sounds great, right? Now, I'm not going to lie and say that we don't have a problem. We do. But let's take a minute to think about who is responsible for this mess. Big globalist corporations. And who is benefiting the most from the UN's agendas? Big globalist corporations. Because ultimately, they would be the ones receiving the contracts for the establishment of a supersized control grid, construction of 5G microwave-powered smart cities, and a new high-speed railway link between capital cities, all recognised Agenda 2030 Green New Deal ambitions. Let's also not forget the amount of fossil fuels that must be used in the production of this fourth industrial revolution, and the fact that weather modification has been used for decades to help create the illusion of a climate emergency. But getting back to Boris, who is he? Well, the Johnsons are very much a political family, with Boris's father and 2 siblings and 2 family spouses all politically connected. He's related to former Prime Minister David Cameron, who married someone from the Astor bloodline, and both of them are related to the royal family. So this is classic rule by bloodline. Boris's father, Stanley Johnson, wrote a number of books throughout his career, many of them about the population problem and how we need to depopulate. There's also a book that he wrote entitled The Virus, a fiction book about a novel viral pandemic and the race for a vaccine. Sound familiar? Now, Boris has been spouting the Build Back Better slogan, also coined by US Democratic presidential candidate and corrupt politician Joe Biden. This slogan comes directly from the UN, so we know who's pulling the strings of the Democratic Party. Now let's talk about one of the main tools used against the public to propagandise and manipulate people's behaviours, the Behavioural Insights team. This is the organisation behind such carefully crafted mantras like stay alert, control the virus, save lives, and hands, face, space. They're also responsible for the amount of fear and panic put onto people, leading to higher rates of stress and suicide, because they know that fearful people are easily controlled. They carefully craft the propaganda that you see everywhere. Behavioural manipulation is mind control. And when you look through their website at who they work with the United Nations Environment Programme and the United Nations Development Programme. The WHO also has its own Behavioural Insights team. And look at how well they've done in changing everyone's behaviours. It's like magic. Now let's talk about the Fabian Society, and you'll see why in a minute. Here's a clip from Truthstream Media's video entitled Understanding the Fabian Window.
Now, I've talked about this before, but George Orwell probably named his infamous book 1984 after the Fabian Socialist, as after all, they were founded in 1884, and they were explicitly proponents of gradualism, of change over time, progressively, through the decades, and so a century would be a very notable marker. Like a lot of people, I was taught 1984 in high school, and it was actually the book that my English teacher really taught us how to analyze literature with, how to read between the lines and pick things apart. And like a lot of people, I had to write an essay comparing 1984 to Brave New World and answering the question of which one was more likely to come true, which dystopian future was more imminent. But it took me many years to realize the connections behind the scenes of those books. George Orwell, aka Eric Blair, had actually been a pupil of Aldous Huxley. I believe he learned French from him at the Eton boarding school. And by that time, I realized who Aldous Huxley's family was. T.H. Huxley, the bulldog of Darwin, his brother Julian Huxley, and the role they played in eugenics and their promotion of the New Age, the New Order of the Ages. And also their connection to H.G. Wells and similar figures, and their connection to Fabian socialism. And back when we were first reading 1984, of course, one of the questions that came up was, what does the title mean? Where did Eric Blair, George Orwell get the idea for it? And the most common story you'll hear is that, well, he finished it in 1948, and he and his publisher talked about it, and they didn't know what to call it, so they just inversed the numbers, 1948, 84, end of story. They decided against his alternate title, The Last Man in Europe. But of course, that story doesn't make any sense, and there's no proof that it's true. Although it's never been explained, a much more likely explanation comes in the fact that his wife, Eileen Blair, before they had met when she was still Eileen O'Shaughnessy, had just read Brave New World, which was published in 1932, and she wrote a poem in 1934 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of her high school, Sutherland High School magazine, that she called End of the Century 1984. It's a relatively short poem with a death, birth, and phoenix section, where society basically dies, and the old authors, Shakespeare, Yeats, Horace, Virgil, and what have you, are outmoded, and their books are dusty and distant. And in the New Age, his wife hints at crystal palaces and sun-bronzed scholars who learn by tuning their thought to telepathic Station 9, where they learn the useful sciences and the arts of telesalesmanship. In the Phoenix section, she connects old authors with new and says that Huxley shares Platonic food, while Bacon's colleague is Einstein, and so forth. At any rate, Orwell's wife was only 39 years old when she died, which happened to be in the final year of World War II. And pretty much the only major thing Orwell did with the rest of his life was write 1984, and it makes sense that his title was in many ways a tribute to the poem she wrote, End of the Century 1984. And again, Orwell came to know Aldous Huxley personally and studied under him, and later Huxley issued basically a rebuttal to 1984. And Huxley, who moved in very high circles, introduced George Orwell to a lot of very influential people, many of them part of the Fabian Socialist. And the Huxleys themselves were involved, but maybe not official members. Bertrand Russell was involved, and they were very close with the founders, including H.G. Wells, who was very much a Huxley acolyte himself, having basically risen to prominence under T.H. Huxley's tutelage. So, through that connection, George Orwell came to know a lot of these people and came to despise a lot of them and talk bad about them. Well, the first publication by the Fabians in 1884 was Why Are the Many Poor? And it talked about how to remedy by reallocating wealth of the rich and powerful, dismantling structures, and building social institutions that were supposedly more equitable. And it contains the famous quote that is attributed to the Roman general Fabius Maximus, from where the Fabians get their name, as well as their emblematic gradualism. Why are the many poor proclaimed, quote, "For the right moment you must wait, as Fabius did most patiently, when warring against Hannibal, though many censured his delays. But when the time comes you must strike hard, as Fabius did, or you will be waiting in vain and fruitless." And so that relates directly to one of the Fabian's several logos, which is that of a turtle, an angry tortoise, slowly moving along. How does he beat the rabbit in the race to the finish line? Well, he moves steadily, progressively, gradually. But when I strike hard. And so the Fabians were in favor of a full move into socialism and a takeover of the state and society, but from a practical standpoint, they thought it should be implemented gradually. But there's also their coat of arms, which is quite telling, and that is a depiction of a wolf in sheep's clothing, a deception. And reading from the website ForbiddenSymbols.com on the Fabian Society reads, according to author John Perdue, the logo of the Fabian Society, a tortoise, represents the group's predilection for a slow, imperceptible transition to socialism, while its coat of arms, a wolf in sheep's clothing, represented its preferred methodology for achieving its goal. But the wolf in sheep's clothing symbolism was later abandoned due to its obvious negative connotations. And even though Orwell, aka Eric Blair, was very much a socialist and a proud socialist, he took very serious issue with a lot of the leading socialists, especially from the Fabian corner. And he saw them as basically middle class and upper class and snobbish and hateful of the poor and very, very cold. There was actually an essay written by Arnold Toynbee, the longtime president of the Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and he wrote an essay in his book Acquaintances about the Webbs titled Are They Human?, where he lays out all these examples of how they're very cold human beings, and everybody knows that, and they've called them out, and they're very calculating. But a couple times he saw them be nice to people when they didn't really have to be, and that was when he knew, yeah, they're human. And Orwell saw a lot of the same behavior, and he wrote a great deal about this in his book The Road to Wigan Pier, which was published in 1937. About a year, I think, before he published his other essay on Wells, Hitler, and the World State, where he just laid out all the things wrong with H.G. Wells' thinking and undermining Hitler. In the same sort of time period in The Road to Wigan Pier, Orwell takes to task George Bernard Shaw and the Webbs, all of whom were founders of the Fabian Socialists, who founded it, by the way, along with Edward R. Peace, who was very wealthy and actually worked on the London Stock Exchange before he received a huge inheritance that allowed him to basically retire and start funding all these labor and socialism causes. Very rich irony.
Now, the reason I mentioned the Fabian Society is because it has very close links to the United Nations. The United Nations was created in 1945 with the involvement of the Fabian Socialist Rockefellers and their Council on Foreign Relations. It was designed as a successor to the League of Nations, and it had as permanent members Fabian Socialist Britain, Democratic America, Communist Russia, and National Socialist China. So that explains a lot. I do recommend everyone go and watch this video to get a better understanding of the Fabian Society. Links in the description. Now I'm going to end with a quote from George Orwell's 1984. Do you begin to see then what kind of world we're creating? It's the exact opposite of the stupid hedonistic utopias that the old reformers imagined. A world of fear and treachery and torment, a world of trampling and being trampled upon, a world which will grow not less but merciless as it refines itself. Progress in our world will be progress towards more pain. The old civilizations claimed that they were founded on love or justice. Ours is bounded upon hatred. In our world there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph and self-abasement. Everything else shall destroy everything. Already we are breaking down the habits of thought which have survived from before the revolution. We have cut the links between man and between man and woman. No one dares trust a wife or a child or a friend any longer. But in the future there will be no wives and no friends. Children will be taken from their mothers at birth, as one takes eggs from a hen. The sex instinct will be eradicated. Procreation will be an annual formality like the renewal of a ration card. We shall abolish the orgasm. Our neurologists are at work upon it now. There will be no loyalty except loyalty towards the party. There will be no love except the love of Big Brother. There will be no laughter except the laugh of triumph over a defeated enemy. There will be no art, no literature, no science. When we are omnipotent, we shall have no more need of science. There will be no distinction between beauty and ugliness. There will be no curiosity, no enjoyment of the process of life. All competing pleasures will be destroyed. But always, do not forget this, Winston, always there will be the intoxication of power, constantly increasing and constantly growing subtler. Always at every moment there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face, forever. Now if you enjoyed this, please leave me a like, subscribe if you haven't, share this with your friends and family, and please leave me a comment as well and let me know what you think. Right, cheers.